Young mother has shock of the lifetime after giving birth to miracle triplet. Becoming a parent is never an easy task. After all, deciding to raise a child is one of the most important things a person can do with their life. When Becky Jo Allen found out she was pregnant, even she didn't know what the future had in store for her. Every pregnancy is different, and no two mothers experience the process the same way. With that being said, Becky Jo and her family couldn't have asked for a more fascinating and miraculous story. Keep on reading to follow the journey of Becky Jo and her stunning triplets. Becky Jo Allen and Liam Tierney lived in Liverpool, England, along with their daughter Indiana. At the time, Becky Jo and Liam had wanted desperately to add another member to their young and growing family. Unfortunately, young Becky Jo experienced serious issues during their efforts, from headaches to nausea. The young couple didn't know what was wrong, so they made an appointment to see their doctor. After getting an ultrasound, the couple nervously sat and waited for their results. What could it possibly show? Was Becky Jo going to be okay? As it turns out, Becky Jo and Liam were more than okay. They were expecting. As if in answer to their prayers, the couple found out that Becky Jo was pregnant with triplets. How is that for expanding the family? When Becky Jo and Liam were notified of the news, they were quite clearly shocked. The symptoms that Becky Jo had been displaying before the ultrasound were worrying, but after finding medical help, they were able to move forward in a safe manner. With that being said, this isn't where this extraordinary story ends. Although the pregnancy progressed in a relatively calm way, Becky Jo and Liam weren't completely out of the woods. Around 31 weeks into Becky Jo's shocking triplet pregnancy, another health scare had the family rushing to the hospital. As it turned out, Becky Jo was going to have premature labor in order to save her children. Traditionally, a pregnancy will culminate in roughly 38 weeks. Becky Jo, however, was forced to undergo an emergency C-section at just 31 weeks. Fortunately, the family was taken prompt care of by an incredible team of medical professionals. Thankfully, all 3 boys were born alive and well, albeit underweight. The children were Rocco, Roman, and Rohan. Despite making it out of the emergency C-section, the triplets had to remain in the neonatal intensive care unit for almost 7 weeks. The doctors used this time to monitor the children, as twins and triplets tend to have enhanced health risks when compared to the rest of the population. These health risks can turn life-threatening when not properly treated. Finally, after 6 weeks in the intensive care unit, Becky Jo and Liam were able to take their family home. During their long wait, Becky Jo worked hard to make sure her home was prepared. The triplets had an entire room carefully decorated and prepared for their new boys. At this point in time, the couple thought that they were finally ready to get back to normalcy. We don't need to tell you that having triplets is an exceedingly rare accomplishment. At the time, Becky Jo was only 23 years old, and she was not partaking in any fertility assistance. With such odds stacked against her, the chances that Becky Jo would have become pregnant with triplets were nearly 1 in 9,000. Despite the health and happiness of her children, Becky Jo couldn't help but notice that something was a little different. Various people in the street would make comments about the boys and how similar they looked, so Becky Jo decided to get a DNA test done on her children. Could she possibly have a pair of identical twins? Were her boys fraternal twins? Triplets typically look similar, however they tend to be fraternal, so this was a curious situation. When the results came back from the DNA test, Becky Jo had the shock of her life. As it turned out, all 3 of her boys had come from the same egg. That meant that Liam and Becky Jo had identical triplets. The doctors were so taken aback by this revelation that they had to perform a second test. The actual science behind Becky Jo's triplets is as fascinating as you'd expect. For Becky Jo, she had 1 egg split into 2. Before the second egg broke apart once again. Having an egg separate twice is almost unthinkably rare. In fact, the whole scenario was incredibly rare. To think Becky Jo and Liam had been struggling with pregnancy and now they were overflowing with children. The odds of having identical triplets are exceedingly rare. In fact, you'd probably be better off trying to win the lottery. The chances of having identical triplets could range from 1 in 60,000 all the way to 1 in 200 million. Needless to say, Becky Jo and Liam were borderline speechless. What makes identical triplets even more fascinating is the fact that they have the exact same DNA. The exact same DNA, as in nothing is different from one child to the next, outside of their fingerprints and teeth marks. Otherwise, Rocco, Rohan, and Roman would all have the same hair, eyes, and blood type. If you have never seen twins, much less triplets, you're probably wondering how a mother can tell her children apart. While Becky Jo had a little trouble at first, as the children aged, everything would become easier. Becky Jo pointed out that they have different birthmarks as well as wildly different personalities. Not so hard now, is it? Would you be able to tell these children apart at a glance? While Becky Jo learned how to tell her children apart, that didn't mean that mothering a brood of 4 was easy. After all, Becky Jo still had to include her eldest daughter. While Liam was a supportive member of the household, the two did not remain together. As a result, Becky Jo had to mother an entire family largely on her own. That is no easy task for even the most devout mother. Raising a single child can be an exorbitantly expensive process. Can you imagine raising triplets along with your older child all on your own? Everything that Becky Jo had to pay for, she had to quadruple it. Along with her financial stress, Becky Jo was quickly finding herself at wit's end due to a lack of time. Her children had to take nearly 130 naps every single week. Despite all of the hurdles that Becky Jo had to clear, she was supported and surrounded by people who cared for her. With help from her extended family, as well as Liam, Becky Jo was able to navigate the consuming waters of motherhood. Even with 4 kids, Becky Jo found a way to make it all happen. While the boys may be the star of our story, Indiana shouldn't be forgotten about. Despite her brothers being fawned over, Indiana never showed any jealousy, nor did she hold it against her new siblings. Instead, Indiana fell just as in love with her brothers as the rest of the family. If a 1 in a million event happens in your life, you might as well share it on Instagram, and that's exactly what Becky Jo did. Becky Jo began documenting her journey on Instagram, and in the intervening years, she has gained quite the following. Right now, Becky Jo has over 60,000 followers, all who fawn over Becky Jo's children right alongside. With so many social media followers, Becky Jo was able to generate interest and support from sources around the world. The internet can be a wonderful thing as it provides us a bridge across which we can meet people from every corner of the planet. Speaking of meeting new people, we aren't quite done with fascinating and miraculous stories of expecting mothers. We have already extensively discussed the rarity of having triplets, so we won't double down on those stats. Instead, we'll point out that triplet birth rates have been declining for years, though Becky Jo was not the last or even the most famous of the new parents. Another mother, Karen Gilbert, had triplets that she would differentiate with different nail colors. Carrie Lyons, who had 3 sons, has written extensively about her own triplets. Back in Becky Jo's household, the boys were already growing up fast. Every single major milestone was accomplished 3 times over. What did this mean? Well, let's just say that birthdays are always going to be a festive occasion in Becky Jo's household. Roman, Rocco, and Rohan all happily share their balloons, presents, and cakes, while Indiana helps her mother decorate. More than 2 years after her triplets stole headlines around the country, Becky Jo is still finding support in unexpected places. Every time that she goes out, Becky Jo hears remarks about her lovely family. She also gets to enjoy telling people that she has identical triplets, a feat almost unheard of in most corners of the globe. Despite complications during her pregnancy, resulting in premature birth, all of Becky Jo's children have managed to live a normal and healthy life. Rocco, Roman, and Rohan all live and play just like any other small boys would. Still, Becky Jo is a mom, so she is always going to be worried and watching out for her boys. The future is looking bright for Becky Jo and her lovely family, and that is something to be thankful for. While Becky Jo's story was truly miraculous, it isn't the only one we have to share with you. Meet Kevin and Nicole, a pair of newlyweds who were struggling to start their own family. Despite their efforts, Kevin and Nicole came to realize that something was wrong. The duo was just not having any success. On the other end of the spectrum, we have Liana and Sean. Liana and Sean live in East Moriches in New York. At the time, Sean and Liana had 5 of their own children. Getting pregnant was not a problem for the family, unlike Kevin and Nicole. Little did Kevin and Nicole know their friend was going to change their lives. As their inability to get pregnant began to take a toll, Nicole and Kevin began exploring alternative options. The newlywed couple was willing to try just about anything to build the family that they had all dreamed of together. Liana would go on to approach her friend with a very serious and kind offer. She was willing to be their surrogate mother. A surrogate pregnancy involves an arrangement, typically bound by law, where one woman will give birth on behalf of another woman, ceding parental responsibilities following the birth of the child. Surrogacy is a fascinating experience as it shows just how pure someone's heart can be. Liana was willingly offering her body up to gift her friend with their new child. Kevin and Nicole talked over the idea before agreeing. After all, they had explored every avenue possible, and they were no closer to finding success. A surrogate pregnancy with one of their closest friends made sense to everyone. In 2016, an embryo would be implanted in Liana, and the couples would wait with bated breath. Before we find out what happened with Liana and Nicole, we need to rewind our story. When Nicole and Kevin had gotten married in 2010, they had known right away that they wanted a child. As the days turned to weeks and the months turned to years, Nicole's inability to get pregnant became a cause for concern. After talking to the family doctor about her health, Nicole would find out that she was suffering from a rare autoimmune disorder. This disorder, which we will detail soon, would become the inciting force for their decision to pursue a surrogate mother. If nothing else, at least Nicole had answers about her health. Nicole would end up being diagnosed with something known as thrombotic thrombocytopenia purpura, otherwise known as TTP. When Nicole had been diagnosed, she was told that the disorder could have been fatal. TTP frequently causes blood clots to form throughout the body. Nicole was lucky to end up at the hospital in time to get a diagnosis. TTP is an extremely rare disorder that can cause a host of health defects. Symptoms such as fatigue and fever were common, while random bruises appearing on her arms rounded out the symptoms. TTP impacts roughly one person out of every 100,000. Nicole found herself an unlucky number of an extremely niche group of disorders. Due to the nature of the disorder, Nicole knew that getting pregnant would end up being a dangerous proposition. Anytime that you have issues with blood clotting, the actual act of giving birth becomes even more dangerous. What's more, Nicole would be told that her TTP medication could potentially harm any baby that she became pregnant with. After breaking the news with her husband, Nicole and Kevin would immediately get to planning an alternative. While Nicole was shattered by the news, Kevin refused to let her mourn alone. Kevin stayed by her side while coming up with viable alternatives in order to make their dream of a family become reality. For what it's worth, Kevin and Nicole did pursue the idea of adopting a child. However, the couple quickly realized that adopting their baby would end up being so expensive as to be impossible. Upon realizing that adoption was on the outs, Nicole froze her eggs just in case a surrogate mother would appear in the future. Nicole and Kevin quickly found that surrogacy was even more expensive than adopting a child. In fact, to enlist a surrogate mother, Kevin and Nicole would need to come up with $75,000. Fortunately, Kevin and Nicole had extremely kind and caring friends. After sharing the news regarding her inability to get pregnant, Nicole's friends would step up to the plate. After Liana went to the doctor to have the embryo implanted, she was met with bad news. The embryo had not taken. For Liana and Nicole, this wasn't the end of the story. Both couples knew that this was a possibility, so they promised to try again in the future. This time, luck was on the side of Liana and Nicole. When Liana got the news from the doctor, both families were over the moon. The second embryo had taken, and Liana would end up getting an ultrasound. The ultrasound would reveal the most stunning thing of all. Liana was pregnant with twins. The announcement was as emotional and joyful as you could possibly imagine. Today, we've gotten to see how 3 different families handled their own miraculous experiences with childbirth. From Becky Jo and Liam to Nicole and Liana, everyone's path to parenthood can be a winding and difficult experience. Yet all families involved end up finding their way to the happy families that they dreamed of. There is something to be said for staying hopeful.